Anna Rose is co-founder of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. In 2009, she was named the Environment Minister's Joint Young Australian Environmentalist of the Year. Anna is an author, editor, speaker, blogger, opinion writer on climate change and energy issues. She was recently named one of Sydney's 100 most influential people and is a 2010 Churchill Scholar. Would you please join me in welcoming Anna Rose?
Hi everyone. I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country we're on. I'm very glad we got a welcome to country, the people of the Yugara Nation. For more than 60,000 years, over 500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations looked after this country. And in the 220 years since this land was stolen from them, we've managed to mess up our water, our soil, and our air. Now we have maybe 10 years, maybe less, to turn that situation around. But you know that rule that says the amount of time you have available is the amount of time it ends up taking? Like if you have an essay that you've had for a month, it does take you that whole month. But if you've forgotten about it and only remember the night before, you can still do it in one night. I'm hoping that rule applies to the climate crisis too. I've been filming a documentary with the ABC about climate change recently, and as part of that, a couple of weeks ago, I stood on top of the world's largest volcano. It's called Mauna Loa, and it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in Hawaii. It's relevant to all of us here today because it was the place where concentrations of carbon pollution in the atmosphere were first measured in 1955, long before we were born, and it continues to measure concentrations of carbon pollution today. The scientist who started measuring that carbon was called Charles David Keeling, and he kept measuring it even when there were gaps in his funding, and even when people said to him, "Why are you measuring carbon? Why on earth would that be important?" But he kept measuring it because he knew that what he was seeing unfolding was a story that would be very relevant to our generation and the biggest crisis that we face today. Scientists have watched as the levels of carbon pollution in our atmosphere has skyrocketed, and they've watched as the global average temperature has skyrocketed. It's now 1 degree Celsius more than what it was at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And that might sound small, but 1 degree has already caused droughts so bad that the government of Russia was forced to stop all wheat exports. 1 degree might sound small, but it already has caused droughts and floods that have devastated communities across South Asia, particularly Pakistan and Bangladesh. And 1 degree is causing conditions that create mega fires so bad that the Australian climate scientist David Caroli warned that we are unleashing hell on earth. Based on the pollution we've already emitted and the amount of coal, oil and gas that the world wants to burn, we may have already locked in global average temperature rises of maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe even 5 degrees. We don't know. But we do know that we've changed the acidity of the oceans and we've changed the composition of the atmosphere. We know that the world that we will see at the end of our lifetimes is going to be a very different world from the one that we were born into. We also know that we are the last generation with the ability, in terms of the time frame, to stop the worst impacts of climate change happening. So we must fight. Past generations fought for us. Our great-grandparents fought to give women the right to vote, and Australia was the second country in the world, after New Zealand, to bring that into law. Our grandparents' generation fought World War II so that we would be able to grow up in a world free from fascism. And our parents' generation did everything they could to prevent the Cold War, a nuclear war between two great superpowers. to prevent it from destroying our futures. Past generations did all this for us, and now it's our time. Don't let anyone ever tell you that you're the leaders of tomorrow. You're the leaders of today. Don't let anyone tell you to wait your turn. Martin Luther King was 26 years old when he led the Montgomery bus boycotts. The civil rights freedom riders were 19. Charlie Perkins was 29 years old when he led the freedom rides from Sydney University into regional Australia to fight discrimination against Aboriginal people. William Wilberforce was 27 years old when he launched his campaign for the abolition of slavery. The bills that he introduced to the UK Parliament were voted down no less than 11 times, but he eventually won. And in 1836, Harriet Hanson led hundreds of women and girls out of a textile mill in Massachusetts to strike for higher pay and shorter hours. She was 11 years old. So the next time someone tells you that you're too idealistic, remind them of Dr. King. Remind them of Charlie Perkins. And remind them of Harriet Hanson. You are the leaders of today, and you have to be, because there's no one else. We can't wait until tomorrow. We don't have until tomorrow. It's probably already too late to prevent the collapse of many places and many ecosystems due to climate change. By our actions, our society has already decided that the people of the Pacific are expendable. Sea level rise and storm surges are already devastating their communities, and you already have people moving from places like the Carteret Islands, Kiribati and Tuvalu. By our actions, we've already decided that the people of the Torres Strait in our own country are expendable. Climate change is affecting them already right now. And by our actions, the world has already decided that the people of Bangladesh have to be sacrificed for our economy and our way of life. There are 160 million people in Bangladesh, and 70% of that country is less than a metre above sea level. Less than 1 metre. What does that mean? Well, a few weeks ago, as part of this documentary, I was meeting with the chief oceanographer of the US Navy. He'd just come from a meeting at the Pentagon, and he told me that the Navy's conservative estimate for sea level rise by the end of the century is at least 1 metre. James Hansen, NASA's chief climatologist, is worried about sea level rises of potentially 7 metres or more as we see the Arctic and Greenland melt. But this doesn't mean that there's nothing left to fight for. In fact, there's more to fight for than ever, because our generation has the task of steering our civilization through the greatest and most rapid period of change that any generation has ever experienced. And whilst the odds are against us, and if you understand how bad the science is, you might be tempted to bet that we would lose. As Bill McKibben says, that's not a bet that you're allowed to make. There is no guarantee that we will win. But the only thing that a morally awake person can do when the worst thing that can happen is happening is to do everything we can to change those odds. So we need to guarantee at least this. We need to guarantee to each other that we will do everything we can, that we will fight with everything we've got. Our national anthem says, "Australians all, let us unite, for we are young and free." We are young. We are the youth climate movement. No one is going to be more idealistic, more passionate, more driven, more committed, more ready to make sacrifices than we are. And we are a young species in the perspective of geological time. Humans have only been on this planet for 200,000 years. 200,000 years. But we've only been burning fossil fuels on an industrial scale for 200 years, around that. So compare that with sea turtles. Yep, sea turtles. Another species. They evolved hundreds of millions of years ago. Right after this speech, I'm getting on a helicopter and going to Heron Island on the Great Barrier Reef. It is a turtle breeding ground. Out of all the ways that climate change is affecting and threatening turtles, and there are many, one of the most worrying factors is how warming sands will affect the next generation of turtle embryos. Did you know that when baby turtles grow in their eggs in the sand, it's the temperature of that sand that determines both their sex and their physical strength? Within the right temperature range, you get a roughly 50-50 mix of male and female turtles. But the last few breeding seasons, the turtles have mostly been female because the sand has been too hot. By 2070, the models anticipate sand temperatures which would bring about a near complete feminisation of turtle hatchlings, and you have female turtles searching for mates that don't exist. The other impact of the warming sands is that the warmer the sand, the weaker the hatchling. So when these little turtle hatchlings push their way out of the shells and have to scramble across the sand and onto the reef with all the predators like sharks, only the strongest ones survive. So if the sand is too hot, they're too weak to make it. Our actions in the last few hundred years are killing species that have been around for millions of years. Our national anthem says we are young and we are free, but how free is our generation? We are locked into an energy system that makes billion-dollar profits from a tiny group of rich people and locks in the destruction of our futures. How free is our economy? If we really lived in a free market, then Australia wouldn't be subsidising fossil fuels to the tune of $11 billion a year in Australia and $500 billion globally. How free are our politicians? They're beholden to the vested interests that fund their election campaigns and a media funded by advertising from companies that got us into this mess in the first place. They put the next election ahead of the next generation every time. We have the potential to power our society from an energy source that is truly free, the sun, the wind and the waves. And we are free to choose our response to the climate crisis. By coming here, you've chosen hope and courage. We'll never have as much money as the coal companies and the polluters. We'll never have money to pay for industry lobbyists and an opposition leader to do our bidding. We've got to use what we have, which is a movement. With people in this room, we can switch Australia to 100% clean energy, and it's our job as a movement to do this. We all understand the level of injustice that's happening, and the question is now, what are we prepared to do about it? Earlier this year, I spent a couple of days with a young man in America called Tim DeChristopher. He's now serving a 2-year jail sentence for placing fake bids at an oil and gas auction in Utah. He said to a speech at US Power Shift in Washington, D.C., "When will we decide that stopping this injustice is more important than me graduating on time? When will we decide that stopping this injustice is more important than my career plans?" I'll tell you a quick story before I finish. The year before a small group of us set up the AYCC, I dropped out of law school for a year, just 1 year, to work on campus clean energy campaigns like what Ellen described. And we had victory after victory after victory. But I went back to law school and I finished my degree whilst helping set up the foundations for this movement. But if I'd known then what I know now about the science and about how urgent it is, I would have deferred that entire degree, because I'm never going to be a lawyer. How can we go on thinking that everything is happening as normal when there's nothing normal happening in our atmosphere? We have a duty to rearrange our own lives until we've solved this crisis. We don't need anything other than what we already have to win: our minds, our bodies, and most importantly, our hearts. Because this debate isn't going to be won in the halls of science. The science is already so clear. And it won't be won in the halls of Parliament because politicians will never, ever, ever soar higher than what their constituents demand. So we need to use our hearts and use words like responsibility and stewardship and the right for future generations to survive and the freedom to be able to power our communities from clean energy. Finally, we need to do our work from a place of love. We are in a crisis and there are people out there causing great harm to our generation. But in a crisis, we need to turn to each other, not on each other. So let's show the world that because we love this country, we can't settle for the world as it is. We can't settle for the future as they want to write it for us. AYCC said in Copenhagen, and we'll say it again, that the future will not be written for us, it will be written by us. To see our future, we need to stop looking down at mining holes and start looking up at the sun and the wind and the faces of young people who want to work in clean energy jobs. So if you think it's time for our generation to take back the country that we love from the small handful of fossil fuel companies who are destroying our futures, you're in the right place today. If you think it's time Australia stopped doubting and started dreaming about the potential we have, then you're in the right place today. Don't let anyone ever pigeonhole you as a radical. We are not the radicals. The people who are fundamentally altering the composition of our atmosphere are the radicals. That is the most extreme thing in this fragile planet that anyone could do. And don't let anyone tell you we can't afford to do this, because we can print out money to bail out a bank, but we can't print out life to bail out a planet. We can't afford not to do this. I had a dream when I was 22 and when we were setting up the AYCC that we would create a movement in this country that would go beyond politics as usual and would go beyond left and right. That young people, all kinds of young people, would stand up and say to our parents, to our bosses and to our politicians, stop. Enough is enough. Stop fighting. This is about our futures. I see that dream coming true today. Thank you so much.